Welcome to Woman. I'm your host, Naima Latif, and I want you to grab a pen, call a friend, and stay tuned in because this is a show you don't want to miss. I want to introduce you to my co-host to my left,
Elizabeth Johnson.
And this evening, we've got a treat for you because we're interviewing award-winning journalist James O'Shea and investigative reporter Bridget O'Shea, and we're going to find out about a book that everybody needs to read. James O'Shea, of course, is someone who has been in the news for quite a while, and now he's giving us his new book, The Deal from Hell. We want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you've got an extensive background, and this is something that is really going to help us understand the inside story behind the news business. Tell us a bit about your background in the news industry.
I began reporting in Iowa with the Des Moines Register, and after a little stint in the Army, where I really got into reporting, and then I became a reporter and editor at the Chicago Tribune, and eventually became the managing editor there, the person who runs the newsroom. And then in 2006, I went to become the editor of the Los Angeles Times. And I did that until 2008 when I had a fellowship. And after the fellowship, I started what is now known as the Chicago News Cooperative in Chicago.
And that's something we're going to definitely find more about. Now, Bridget O'Shea, you, of course, as an investigative reporter, you did a lot of the research that went into this book. The Deal from Hell. How did you get started in the journalism industry?
Well, I always liked to write. That was kind of always my passion. And I started out in 2002. I went to journalism school at Columbia College here in Chicago. And I interned at a community newspaper in 2002. And then I did some public relations work for some nonprofits, writing press releases and stuff like that. I enjoyed that a lot. And then I kind of branched off for a little while. I went to veterinary technician school. I got a license to be a veterinary technician. And then I decided I wanted to go back into journalism. So I started working for the CNC, the Chicago News Cooperative, and I did some research for James O'Shea's my father, so I did some research for my father's book.
Excellent.
So that's kind of my story.
Well, I love to see a family that works together. And now, one of the things that impressed me, of course, you obviously know the insides of how to report and how to investigate and even how to lead a news crew. The Tribune's news staff received 6 Pulitzer Prizes under your leadership. Is that correct?
Right. That's it was a glory. I of course am not the only one that did that. We had an editor, Anne Marie Lipinski, who led the staff too, and other people that worked with me. But it was at the time, the managing editor traditionally is the person that runs the newsroom on a day-to-day basis. And when I was managing editor, that's when we won quite a few Pulitzer Prizes. Yes,
for certainly some excellent investigative reporting.
Right, most of the Pulitzers were for stories like we did a big series, a lot on the criminal justice system and the death penalty, and we talked about, how was the death penalty, does a person who is poor, African American living on the south side of Chicago have a greater chance of being executed than a white person that lives in Winnetka, and we demonstrated that that was true, and really kind of helped change the debate on the inequities in the death penalty throughout the country.
Well, the news industry is so critical in keeping our freedom because when we can't get information, then we don't really know what's happening in our lives. We don't really know who's behind the scenes controlling things. Tell us about the Chicago News Cooperative.
Well, that started after I wrote this book.
Yes.
This book really is about the collapse of the Tribune Company, which owns the Chicago Tribune, and the Times-Mirror Company, which owned the LA Times. And in 2000, the Tribune Company bought the Times-Mirror Company. And then they began running all these newspapers. It was a huge conglomerate based here in Chicago. And the book is really about how that merger didn't work. And but the broader story is really all of the themes that led to the demise of that company and that merger. It's now in bankruptcy. All of the things that were happening there were happening throughout the country in other newspapers. So the book is really more about the collapse of the newspaper industry, the role that Wall Street played in that, the role the management played in that, and even some of the role that some of the journalists played in that.
Without giving away all of the book, why did these papers start to merge? Why did these news organizations start to form these big conglomerates?
Well, because in the it started really in the 60s and the 70s, and the newspapers traditionally were owned by families, and they were, and so there were famous families, at the McCormicks and the Medills in Chicago, the Pattersons in New York, the Grahams in Washington, D.C., the Chandlers in Los Angeles, and then as the tax laws became quite onerous, and they changed the way newspapers were taxed, and so the families that had all these newspapers and they wanted to sell them and get their money, they didn't want to really, if they sold them to another family, the tax was very high, but if they sold them to a corporation that gave them stock, there was a very low tax. Yeah. So they began selling.
Corporate takeover.
Right, they began, this really started, and over the years they began becoming public companies that stock was owned by the public, because that really eased the tax bite. And as they got the stock, it made them easier to issue stock to buy other newspapers. So the companies became huge, big. And by the 1990s, the majority of American newspapers were owned by newspaper chains.
So these newspaper chains, then, did they have a certain political agenda, the reason why they wanted to own all of the news organs?
They really wanted money. That was their agenda. They wanted to make a lot of money.
I see. Well, that really tells us what the motivation is behind everything we're seeing, all of the industry that has to do with journalism and reporting. There's always the financial end of it, and always that's the incentive. But now you founded the Chicago News Cooperative.
Right.
And that was after you had done the book and had that inside view. What does the Chicago News Cooperative do?
Well, the Chicago News Cooperative really grew out of this book, really, because when I saw what was happening, as the newspapers encountered financial troubles in 2000 and going forward, they began cutting back in what I consider vital areas of coverage. The foreclosure crisis, the courts, the city hall. And so we decided to try to form something that first was going to be an online news organization. And it was really, the whole idea was to create a nonprofit that would not, and create a system that would be self-sustaining, in which users would participate and pay to become a member of the co-op, and we would create these kind of news interest networks, we call them. So if you're interested in education in Chicago, and you want a really detailed information on Chicago and the Chicago schools, and you can't get it anywhere else, if you become a member of the cooperative for like $2 a week, you would get this specialized coverage. And we began trying to build these we call them vertical sites, but basically in-depth news areas of coverage that were tied together with social networking. And so that's how we got both younger reporters like Bridget to work for us, and we have older experienced reporters, and we blended them together in this co-op. And now we employ both freelance and on full-time about 20 reporters, and we go out and cover things in the city which we feel are not getting really good coverage from the traditional media in the city. So
is all of this internet-based in terms of the sites that people go on for the news, or is any of it in print? Yeah,
early on though, the New York Times got wind of what we were doing and said they would like to put Chicago pages in their Midwest edition that circulates here. So we cut a deal with them, and we provide 2 pages of news, Chicago news, twice a week on a Friday and Sunday for the New York Times. And then we have a website that also produces news every day.
So is it possible that the Chicago News Cooperative could begin to supply this kind of news coverage to papers all over the country, where they're maybe cutting back on the real investigative reporting that we need?
Well, that would be our hope, that we would get others to pay for this kind of content.
Right now we're very locally focused in Chicago,
Well, I know you've done some great stories on the housing crisis and particularly the foreclosure crisis, because so many people thought it was just them losing their homes and
Right.
just them that the banks were giving the shaft to. So what went into that investigative story when you kind of uncovered the inside story behind how these banks were mistreating people?
Well, we started off, and actually Bridget is the person who really got the ball rolling on this. So why don't you tell them a little bit, Bridget, about how you found Wanda Carter?
Well, we went to a press conference on the South Side, and someone at the press conference mentioned a few people that had been hit pretty hard with the foreclosure crisis, and they gave us some names, and that's how we found the people that we talked to, and we kind of went deeper into their stories, and we did a kind of case study on, we zeroed in on one person and kind of told their story about how they lost their home and how they were not able to get a loan modification, and how the loan modification program they felt was misleading, and a lot of people feel that the loan modification program is very misleading, and they make it sound like it's very easy to get these modifications when in truth it's really not. So that's kind of how the whole thing got started and how that one story was written, and we've written a few more about the housing crisis. We've really covered that pretty heavily.
Yes.
Well, and the idea was, okay, can you tell the story of one person's story as kind of the smaller story about the big story?
Yes.
And so we picked one house on the South Side, and we went and found the owner, and she gave us her story, and she had some documents that we used to contact the banks that were involved and started saying, okay, why did you do this, and what was going on here, and why did you do it? Of course, the banks didn't want to talk about it too much.
But that's usually how it is. Our producer, Wanda Carter, very strong go-getter,
Right,
when she
right.
was talking about what happened, I said, this really sounds crooked on the part of the banks. So does it get difficult when you're challenging an institution like the banking industry, the housing industry, when you're challenging them, even with the newspaper industry, and there's big money behind it? Does it get difficult to do investigations because people don't want to talk to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bridget. Why don't you talk about some of the difficulties Bridget, a reporter, has when they're trying to get information from like a bank or
Yes, and they have to give you
getting a
information.
hold of, sometimes just simply getting a hold of someone is very hard.
Like the person who
you
actually
get,
makes a decision.
Yeah, you get bounced around a lot from this person to that person, and you're leaving messages and people don't call you back, and when you finally do get a person, they don't want to talk, and sometimes they can be kind of hostile.
Ooh.
And it can be a very challenging task.
So what method do you use to make people talk to you when you know that you're about to break a story that has national and maybe international significance? How do you get them to talk to you?
Well, usually, I think one of the things is you have to have good documents in a question. If you call somebody up and say, how come you foreclosed on a house, they're going to tell you they don't want to talk to you. But if you call them up and you say, I'm sitting here looking at a appraisal that you did on a house down on such and such Woodlawn Avenue or wherever it was, and you said it was worth $142,000, and several months later, and the appraiser came along and said it was only $95,000. So if you have that kind of specifics,
Then
they have to
address
talk
it.
to you. But if you just ask a broad general question, they don't. So Bridget and I had those kinds of specifics, and so they had to respond in some way. But most of the time, they still will say, well, we can't talk about a person's private mortgage or something like that.
But when a person gives you the information, then that opens the door for you to be able to talk about it, because it's not like they're revealing it. The person's already revealed it to you themselves.
But a lot of times the banks will say, well,
can't
we
talk
still
about
won't talk about somebody's personal information.
Well, when you were working with the major papers, of course, when you started out as a reporter and won a lot of awards, what were some of the challenging stories that you covered where you had to go up against the power structure and pull out information?
Well, like when I was in Washington, I did a big story on cost overruns on the Los Angeles class submarine, attack submarine. And those companies, it was General Dynamics, they were owned by very powerful people. And they would try to get you not to write about it by telling you nobody ever really came up to me from the newspaper and said, don't write about this. But they would call their, somebody on the board or the directors or one of the bosses, and they'd say, this guy's really got it wrong. He doesn't know what he's doing. And so that happened to me on numerous occasions. The whole story of back in the 80s, the collapse of the savings and loan industry,
Yes.
which was frankly the precursor of what just happened.
What just happened.
That was a story that I did where, it was the whole savings and loan industry was basically saying, you don't know what you're talking about. And so I said, a third of the bank savings and loans in this country are broke, a third are half, almost broke, and only a third are healthy. And they said, you're crazy, you don't know what you're talking about. It turned out that was right.
Well, that's one of the things that newspapers have always done in exposing the giants among us that control things. So when the newspaper industry began to get bought up by these major corporate interests, how did that affect the ability of these papers to expose those people that we've been investigating that have the big money? How does that affect it when everybody's kind of in bed together, all the corporate people, the advertisers, everybody got that same financial agenda?
Well, it's not as direct as you might think it is. I mean, the way it really is affected is when they start cutting back and they begin laying off reporters. And a lot of times they'll lay off the higher paid reporters or the more experienced reporters. And so your investigative reporting is something that a newspaper does because it wants to, not because it should do it because it has to and it feels a duty. But a lot of times when they start cutting back on budgets and that's the stuff that goes. And so it's not like someone saying to me, don't write that. It's usually they cut here, they cut there, and as they cut more, there's this enormous profit pressure on newspapers because newspapers used to make a lot of money.
So
And then,
go ahead.
yeah, so, and then in the early 2000s, when Wall Street kept saying we want 20 and 30% returns, and the advertising market was changing, there was a lot of pressure to keep those returns, so they started cutting and laying off people. And that's really the kind of pressure that you see. A lot of times people won't come up to you and say, don't cover this story because they're a big advertiser. Sometimes they do. But if you're an editor, you don't pay attention to that. But if they come up to you and say, you have to cut your budget by 10%, and you have to lay off reporters, well, the more you do that.
So what do you do, lay off the best reporters? Or just the higher paid reporters?
You just try every way you can to preserve that. But sometimes it's really difficult.
So Bridget, what do you see in the future for reporting, for reporters, investigative reporters?
What do I see in the future for investigative? That's a good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's going to continue to be something that that newspapers are going to have.
Okay.
Like Jim was saying, it might be that there's a shift to kind of a younger generation.
That's what I was asking, basically.
Yeah, that it might shift to a younger generation. There's kind of a worry there about a lack of experience. Obviously, investigative reporting takes some experience, and especially good investigative reporting. And, that's a good question because.
So do you have the mentors? I can remember some of the older movies that surrounded reporting, but there was always a mentor. There was always an older guy showing a younger guy, well, this is how you do it. Don't rush through it. Just kind of sort of be calm, take it easy. It's like, we're gonna rush. No, we're not gonna rush. Yeah. We're just gonna. So do you all still have mentors? Like in investigative reporting at this point, are there enough seasoned investigative reporters that are still in the business? Because I'm listening to James talk about how they're being systematically eliminated.
Right. They start firing staff. They fire the high-paid staff,
right.
which is usually the seasoned, experienced people.
You can like for James, they could probably, if they fire him, they could probably hire 3 brand new people. But he has the experience to help you.
Yeah. I think to an extent that might be diminished in the future. Mentorship. Fortunately, for me personally, at the Chicago News Cooperative, there are some older reporters that are kind of there, you know, they can kind of help you out like that. But I think to an extent it will, you know, that might be no more, that the whole, you know, older mentor in a lot of places, that might not be there anymore, which is unfortunate. That's kind of the way things are going, and it's unfortunate, but that's the way things have been going.
Because I realize that you can't learn everything out of a book.
Oh,
you know,
certainly
like
not,
you,
yeah.
you can go to school for like 10 years, but there's just certain things that Jim knows, you know, just from experience. It's not in a book, you know, that maybe he might want to consider going back and teaching a journalism class. But there's things that he just knows.
You know, I was having, I've wrestled with that because I look, and I viewed my job when I did the CNC as, let's go out and see if we can create some jobs so that people that are journalists have a place to work and can get paid for it and make a living. And I was in the process of that, although what I do is really now I raise money, because that's our initial thing. It's still a philanthropic enterprise until we get enough people to join it, and until we get actually deliver the kind of get the kind of investment we need to create the content that will give people an incentive to join the co-op. And so I'm still really pretty heavily reliant on philanthropy. And in the process of trying to raise funds, I had a conversation with some fellow who was from, of all places, Kathmandu.
Wow.
And he told me, well, I teach journalism, and I said, well, I've really wrestled with, you know, why should I teach journalism if there's no jobs out there? And he said, you know, I got to the point where I quit teaching people how to be journalists, and I'm teaching them why to be journalists.
No, that's
and I
a
thought
good
that
point.
was a really interesting point. And I think with Bridget and the other young people with the Chicago News Cooperative, we do talk a lot about why it's important to be accurate, why it's important to double check everything. And I think that's one of the things, Bridget, that you see every day when you turn in a story. You should talk about how editors that go over your story and question you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, lots of details. You know, it's you know, sometimes something that I haven't even thought about, you know, and they'll say, you know, you need to go back and double check this, or make another phone
being
call.
Wrong could really damage things. I mean, we've had that experience. You know, we reported someone dead that was still alive. You know,
Oh, really?
Those kind of things can be very embarrassing. But you know, there have been a lot of changes in the communications industry. Period. How has the internet affected the news industry? Newspapers, you know, a lot of them. Some of them made the switch, and they have maybe an online version as well as the printed version, but that has affected a lot of things in terms of jobs. How do you see that having effect on the newspaper industry in the future?
The biggest impact it has had is on the business side of the newspaper. You know, a newspaper, most of the time, 80 to 85% of your revenue is advertising. So you put out a newspaper every day, and you're charging 75 cents. It takes about $2 to get it out there and put it on your doorstep. So you're counting on advertising to make up the difference between, say, if you're charging 75 cents and it costs you $2, you're dependent on advertising to bring in that $1.25.
Right.
That's what's starting, and with the internet, has made advertising very cheap. And so newspapers still have this cost of putting this product out there, and they're still spending $2 to get it on your doorstep, but that $1.25 is now down to, say, a quarter, and maybe even less. And so that's the big impact the internet has had. It's been on the business of journalism, and it's made it much more difficult to survive economically, because the main source of your revenue continues to go down, because you know, the Googles of the world rely on a national ad audience and a big audience, and they don't charge anywhere near what the print papers used to charge.
Well, one thing about the internet, there is nobody monitoring whether or not the information you get is accurate, so there's not the same pressure to have your facts straight or to make sure you're documented, because anybody can put anything on the internet. They don't have to be an official journalist, they don't have to be an investigator, they just have to know how to put something on a computer.
And
they're
anonymous.
And a lot of times it's anonymous. So do you see newspapers changing the way they get news to the public? Do you see newspapers eventually disappearing in terms of a printed form, or do you think we'll always have some type of print publication?
I think you'll always have some kind of print publication. It's just going to be more expensive. What frankly worries me is the beauty of a newspaper was that you have the person that was wealthy and made a lot of money, and say living on Gold Coast in Chicago, they got the same newspaper as somebody that was poor and living on the South Side.
That's right.
Yes.
What I fear is the person in the Gold Coast that can afford to pay for $2 or $6 on Sunday for a newspaper will continue to get it, and the person down on the South Side that can't afford that is not going to be getting that, and they're going to have to rely on news off the internet, which is, as you say, is often not as thoroughly vetted and checked and edited as it is in a newspaper.
So how will that affect reporters, as you said, with the Chicago News Cooperative? You're developing a means to create the jobs for those future journalists who want to do the right kind of reporting and investigation. So how will that affect that? Will they have to think in terms of reporting for the internet, or how will they
I think
explore their
reporters like
crafts?
Bridget, they have to be much more nimble in terms of writing a story for the internet and for a newspaper. They just have to have a broader set of skills, and they have to know more about social networking and all these other tools that reporters now use to get their story out.
Well, speaking of social networking, I think her generation has got the social networking down to a fine science.
I mean, even
much better than my generation does.
And it even affects the politics, because you look at the past presidential election, I think one of the reasons why President Obama won is because he had a young staff of people who had mastered the social networking, and so the information went out nationwide over the internet, over cell phones and everything.
They have an acronym, and I want to ask you about this, Bridget, because you're younger than all of us on this panel. Do they have a book of acronyms that we could actually buy? I mean, I know what LOL is and OMG, but they got a whole lot of, they got all these alphabets that they put together, and I'm going, what did she just say? I mean, the whole paragraph is nothing but three consists of 3 letters. I mean, not the whole, just, just, oh my job, OLL, BFF, OMG, SIP. I'm like, what is she saying?
We got about 30 seconds left.
I'm sure there's got to be something out there that you can find that would clear a lot of that up. I mean, there's a lot that I don't even understand, so, because I've seen that before, like whole paragraphs that are nothing but
code.
I'm sure there's something out there that you would be able to find that would kind of interpret that for you. Well, there's got to be at this point in time something like that.
And we are seeing the change of language. Well, we certainly do look forward to reading this book, The Deal from Hell, because we want to find out how moguls in Wall Street plundered great American newspapers. So we know that we need to keep our newspapers, because we've got to know the truth. And we thank you all for joining us as investigative reporters and people who are keeping us informed. And I'm your host, Naima Latif. You've been watching Woman to Woman, and we'll see you again next time.